Praise be Jesus and Mary. In today's Gospel, taken from Luke chapter 4, we hear of our Lord's ministry of exorcism in Capharnaum. St. Luke tells us in verse 32 that Jesus spoke with authority, and the crowd marveled at his healing power. And then it says in verse 36 that they said, "For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out." The Greek word that St. Luke uses there for authority is exousia. It means authority or power. It also means to have the right to do something. St. John says at the end of the book of Revelation, he says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they may have the right," literally exousia, "to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates." So we know that our Lord entrusted his power and his authority to his apostles and their successors, the bishops. A famous bishop whom we celebrated in the liturgy last week, St. Augustine himself once said, and we see this in the Catechism, if you look at number 119, he's quoted there saying, St. Augustine said, "I wouldn't believe in the gospel had not the authority of the Catholic Church already moved me to do so." And also the Vatican II document Lumen Gentium in numbers 25 and 27 reaffirm that the bishops are endowed with the authority of Christ. So not just a mere human authority. We only mention this today because we want to offer a word of discouragement. St. Paul said in the first letter today, he said, "Encourage one another and build each other up." Well, this morning we want to offer a word of discouragement, not encouragement. We want to discourage Catholics from the unhealthy sport or activity of bishop bashing, which is a sport unfortunately played by a lot in certain Catholic circles. I would call bishop bashing simply the constant criticizing and blaming and complaining about the hierarchy. It's clearly a sin against the fourth commandment, where we're told to honor our father and mother, and that commandment refers to all of those who are in authority over us. St. Peter, the first pope, says in 1 Peter 2:17 that Christians are to honor the emperor. He said that. And who was the emperor at the time when he was writing that letter? It was actually Nero, of all people. Nero, who would be the one to actually put St. Peter and St. Paul and a bunch of other Christians to death. If Christians were to honor a wretched emperor, how much more do we honor, or how much more honor do we owe those who are the spiritual heads of the church? It's not a question of giving the bishops a blank check and saying that everything that they do is good. That's not the case. Pointing out things that are wrong or simply that we don't like is one thing. Focusing on those things and constantly criticizing those people is another thing. And the bishop bashers tend to fall into that second category. I think a lot of times it's just the critical, self-righteous spirit that some people have towards pretty much everyone and everything, and they just carry that over into their faith life, right? So if you have a critical or a judgmental spirit in general, it just makes sense that you're going to bring that spirit with you into church. But that spirit does need to be exercised. We have to learn to get rid of that spirit. Just as there are armchair quarterbacks in football, there are also armchair bishops in faith. It's very easy to be an armchair quarterback. It's also pretty easy to be an armchair bishop as well. It's true, again, not all the bishops are saints, clearly, and some are truly sinners and even heretics, at least borderline heretics. That's certainly the history of the church demonstrates that. And sometimes they need to be corrected and even removed at times as well. But that doesn't change the fact that we owe them respect and reverence and obedience. Of course, not everyone agrees with me when I say these things, and people say, "Well, Father, you're pretty naive about the reality of the church, the way that you look at things," and they're probably right in some cases. Certainly in some cases that's probably true. I'm not too well informed about particulars at times. However, I can recognize when someone has a good and a healthy spirituality, so one that's focused on growing in holiness, and when someone has an unhealthy or toxic spirituality, which is one that's focused on something other than growing in holiness. And one of the signs of toxicity is that priest bashing, bishop bashing, cardinal bashing, pope bashing, spirituality or syndrome that some people have, if you want to call it that. One of the first bishops, St. James, wrote in the New Testament letter, his New Testament letter, he said, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Right? James 4:6. So sometimes we need to stop and ask ourselves, is the criticism of the hierarchy that I'm offering or that I'm hearing, is it necessary or helpful? Is it constructive or is it destructive? Is it respectful or is it reactionary and not too respectful? A lot of complaining and criticism that we hear about the hierarchy isn't constructive or helpful. A lot of it just undermines the church itself. Personally, I'm not a big fan of bishop bashing, one, because I'm just one step away from that, right? So if you bash the bishop, who's next? The priests, right? So I'm right in line. I'm the next one in line, so it's understandable, right? But also, even before I was a priest or a religious, I've never been a fan of I've never been one to criticize or complain about the hierarchy. I've always seen a spirit of criticism as a breeding ground for pride and self-righteousness, so simply not my spirituality. Got to avoid those things. And it wasn't St. Francis's spirituality either. He was respectful to those who were Christ's ministers. He strove to see the person of Christ in them, not the sinner in them. When we pass from this life and stand before our Lord, the conversation between us and Him is not going to be about what this cardinal or this bishop or this pope said or did. That's not what the conversation is going to be about. The conversation is going to be about what you said, about what you did with your life. It's called the particular judgment. It's when our judging ceases and God's judging begins. Okay, if we've spent our pre-conversion or our post-conversion lives criticizing and complaining about the church, our Lord just might throw that back in our face and begin to criticize and complain about us. We're not going to find that too pleasant. Jesus said in Matthew 7, verse 2, He said, "For as you judge, so will you be judged. And the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you." So if we want our particular judgment to go well, then we need to start judging others down here with right judgment, but also with mercy too. We've got to pray and intercede for the hierarchy rather than criticize and complain about them. I know of a lady who was from a place where the parishes weren't very good, and even the bishop, it seems, wasn't very faithful to our Lord's teachings. And this lady prayed, and she offered herself to God, and she did a lot of penance. And the situation in her town, but also in her diocese, actually completely changed. Now, there are very faithful priests in the parishes there. There's also a very good bishop there as well, too. And I'm pretty convinced that the change had more to do with her self-offering, with her yes to God, than it did with anything else. And to the best of my knowledge, she wasn't a priest or a bishop basher. She was smarter than that. Prayer and penance are powerful weapons, so we don't need to underestimate them. We shouldn't underestimate them at all. And lastly, perhaps the only thing worse than the sport of bishop bashing is actually subtracting yourself from the authority of your local bishop and the Bishop of Rome by frequenting pseudo-Catholic groups that aren't in full communion with the church, because then you're not just criticizing the authority that Christ, the church, that you're not just criticizing the authority that Christ gave to the apostles and to the bishops, you're actually denying that authority. You're denying it. Traditionally, we used to call that Protestantism. At least when I was growing up, they called that Protestantism. And subtracting ourselves from the authority of the bishops is the logical next step or consequence of the bishop and priest and cardinal and pope bashing spirituality. There are other reasons that people go that route as well, but there's also no excuse for going that route at the same time. If you lose the supernatural vision of the church, then you're obviously going to wander away from her sooner or later. So let's ask Our Lady for the grace to stop criticizing and complaining, and this grace to start doing penance and to start praying instead. And to go back to what we said at the beginning, if we respect and obey the authority that Christ established on this earth, authority exousia in Greek, then we will have the right, exousia, we will have the right to enter paradise where God's authority is respected and reverenced and loved above all else. Praise be Jesus and Mary.